So I'd like to take this opportunity to clarify my personal opinion regarding Jesus mythicism, because my position is a little bit different than some other mythicists. And people ask me often to clarify what I mean by that, expecting me to adopt everybody else's position that I may not really have. So to start with, psychologist Valerie Tirico, a former evangelical Christian, wrote an article for the Raw Story about 5 reasons to suspect that Jesus never existed. And I'm not going to reference that article, but rather an attempted rebuttal of that article that was posted on a blog called True Free Thinker. Now, the blogger is a Christian, meaning that he's beholden to a belief system, bound to a belief system, which has required beliefs and prohibited beliefs, where you have the impossible promise of the eternal reward if you believe what you're told simply because we said so, and they have the threat of the fate worse than death if you believe any differently and commit any of the damnable crimes like heresy, blasphemy, or apostasy, which is the very opposite of a true free thinker. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. I just want to look at this one post rebutting those 5 reasons, counting down from 5. Modern scholars who claim to have uncovered the historical Jesus depict wildly different persons. In summary, the rebuttal to this is that what do modern scholars know that early scholars wouldn't know better? Number 4, the Gospels, our only accounts of a historical Jesus, contradict each other, and there is no rebuttal at this point, only a complaint that the original author repeated herself. Number 3, even the New Testament stories don't claim to be first-hand accounts. And there's no rebuttal of this one either, really. Instead, the not truly a free thinker thinks that it doesn't matter that the Gospels don't read as eyewitness accounts, or that any of the authors identified themselves as characters having anything to do with the story. Just because other people, later on, arbitrarily decided to pretend that this Gospel was written by Matthew and that one by Mark doesn't mean that they didn't accidentally attribute them to the right authors, which of course he believes they did. This is a remote possibility, but even if he's right, that still doesn't address any of these criticisms, now does it? Number 2, the earliest New Testament writers seem ignorant of the details of Jesus' life, which become crystallized in later texts. And Mr. Not Really a Free Thinker gave a fair rebuttal of this one, saying that at least some of the details were given, even if some of them, like the virgin birth, for example, never really happened, though of course he believes that it did. But we know that if there was a historical Jesus, we know that the virgin birth was fabricated and inserted later on, largely out of a misinterpretation. Yeah, along with both of Jesus' contradictory genealogies and a whole hell of a lot of other details, an indeterminable amount of other details about his life. And finally, number 1, no first-century secular evidence whatsoever exists to support the actuality of Yeshua ben Yosef. And Tirico backed this up with a quote from Bart Ehrman, who holds that Jesus was a historic person, but yet he says, even if we include the entire first century of the Common Era, there is not so much as a solitary reference to Jesus in any non-Christian, non-Jewish source of any kind. So, given the challenge of producing a secular reference from a non-Christian contemporary, the Christian blogger responded with 210 textual references, which would have been astounding, so impressive, except that none of them are secular. They're all Christian writings. Only a third of them come from the first century, and only 18 of them could have been considered contemporary with Jesus. And this excludes even the Gospel of Mark, which was written so many decades later that anyone who was still alive by then, anyone contemporary with Jesus, would have been a very old man, kind of impossibly old for that day and age. And most of these sources are from the 2nd or 3rd century, and most of them are apocryphal too, meaning anonymous writings of doubtful origin or authenticity, which are nevertheless circulated as being true. And that's important. Now, included in this list, this blogger included in his textual references, the entirety of the New Testament, as if each of the works included in it was a separate source, even though the first 8 of these were written by the same guy, Paul, who was not an eyewitness himself, though he pretended to be. Paul called himself an apostle and said to the other apostles, "Did I not see Jesus Christ our Lord?" No, you fucking didn't. You might have seen lightning strike on the Damascus road, but whatever you imagined when you were shocked or jolted by a flashing light and a loud noise is not the same thing. And this may be the first example of a Christian claiming to witness things he's never really seen. The blogger's rebuttal was simply to imply that no historian would have mentioned anything about any of the astounding miracles or any of the public controversies relating to Jesus, because they wouldn't write about these things unless they believed in Jesus and were interested in that story. So we're supposed to accept that all of the first century historians ignored all of that because that would only be interesting to Christians. Otherwise, this blinkered believer's blog of counter-arguments, if we can call them that, didn't actually address those 5 points and were largely irrelevant to anything except for the citation of those first few Christian parchments written within a lifetime of Jesus' pointless demise. Now, some of these documents have been challenged and undermined by further study, leaving little more than the Pauline letters, beginning, of course, with Thessalonians. Here, Paul pleads with his personal friends to wait patiently for Jesus' or for God's Son to return from heaven. Because, to be fair, Jesus said that he would return very soon, while some, but not all, of his apostles were still alive. Now, however you interpret that, it still puts his second coming in the first century. So now that all of his apostles have been dead for over 1900 years, I think it's safe to say we've been stood up. He ain't coming. The one line of Thessalonians, the one line of wisdom in Thessalonians says, "Prove all things, hold fast that which is good," which of course Christians don't do, because this line is contradicted by the previous line telling us to pray constantly and continuously. And we'll get into the problem with that in a moment. The next citation, Philippians, says there are already Christian bishops and deacons. Already, that fast. This is a minimum of 30 years after Jesus was supposedly executed. And we already have bishops and deacons? This sounds like a long-established belief system, not in a historical event that only happened a generation earlier. Then comes Galatians, which says that the Scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand unto Abraham, saying, "In thee shall all the nations be blessed. So then they that are of faith are blessed within the faithful Abraham." Which is hilarious to me, because we're talking about all of the Abrahamic religions. That's Islam, Judaism, Christianity, which have all been at war with each other continuously since their inception. That doesn't sound like an eternal blessing. That sounds like cursed damnation to me. Curiously, in Galatians, Paul also says that there are other gospels and other Christs, which we'll get to in a moment. And he says that even angels might preach another gospel. So angels are wandering around preaching other gospels to men? And even they don't know who the real Messiah is? How does Paul know who the real... Whose word do you want to take? And how does Paul know who these angels are? How do you identify when an angel is preaching to people? The second most amusing line is, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked." But yes, he is mocked, often, and for good reason. It's not surprising, seeing that everyone on a mission from God gets a raw deal, especially in the end. Even the Blues Brothers can attest to that. And the next book is 1 Corinthian, as opposed to 2 Corinthians. And my favorite line out of that one is, "I will destroy the wisdom of the wise." So that seems to have been the goal all along. Another quote is, "God chose the things that are not, that he might bring to naught the things that are." So, given this bit of insanity, It's no surprise the damage done in the name of this religion, impeding, retarding, or reversing progress ever since then. And it's amazing to me that Christianity ever got started at all, especially given Paul's oppression and obsession with circumcision. I think his bumper sticker might have read, "Give up everything good about your life and let me cut your dick up with my knife." He also said, "If any man thinketh that he is wise among you in this world, let him become a fool, that he may become wise." Then he describes Christians as fools for Christ's sake. Well, I have to agree with him here, because I define a fool as someone who too readily accepts improbable claims from questionable sources on insufficient evidence. So, of course, it's no surprise that the Bible and the Quran both give the exact opposite definition of a fool. The list of early Christian writings also included the Gospel of Thomas from the heretical collection of Coptic Gospels in the Nag Hammadi Library. Normally this wouldn't be included unless you're really desperate to get some kind of textual reference to Jesus. And this includes one of only a couple things that Jesus ever said that could be considered wise. And when his apostles in the Gospel of Thomas, when they asked Jesus how he felt about the Jewish tradition of whittling weenies, he said, "If God meant for us to be circumcised, we wouldn't be born with foreskins." How can you argue with that? And I think it's funny that everyone is so certain that Jesus existed in every contradictory detail, despite the fact that he never wrote anything, yet we can't be sure if Shakespeare existed despite everything he supposedly wrote. Look at our most popular literary characters now in cinema, besides Jesus Christ, superstar of Nazareth and all that shit. We also have Dracula, Frankenstein, Robin Hood, and King Arthur. And how many more times is Hollywood going to remake all those movies? Of all of them, only Frankenstein is entirely fictitious. Robin Hood is commonly thought to be historic, and perhaps he was. But all of his associates, other than Little John, were apparently added as embellishments by later storytellers, as were most of the legends about him, such that if he really lived, he wouldn't recognize even one scene out of Kevin Costner's movie. So if you could go back in time and meet Robin Hood, and everything he thinks you should remember about his life are things that were forgotten long ago and were never written down, and he doesn't know any of the stories that we attribute to him now, can we say that Robin Hood was a historic character if he himself doesn't think so? Now look at King Arthur, supposedly the king of the Britons in the 6th century. This according to an author writing in the 12th century, who had to adapt historic folklore because by then these stories were kept alive by word of mouth for more than 500 years. And no one knows how much of the story was invented by that first author, but the story of the character of Sir Lancelot and the much more important story of the Holy Grail were reportedly introduced or invented by a French author years later. And I've known highly intelligent, educated professionals who believed in every detail of the Arthurian legends as if it was all historically true verbatim. And I can't help but feel that if we had a time machine, you could never find anyone you would recognize from the court of Camelot. And this, oddly enough, makes Dracula the most historic character of this whole list. He's the only one we can be sure really lived. Born Vlad Tepes III, a Romanian prince in the 15th century. He was called Dracula because he was the son of Vlad Dracul of the Order of the Dragon. But otherwise, his actual life of military campaigns, fighting for one religious order against another, bears no resemblance at all to any of the movies made on that name. Literally everything his patronymic is famous for now was invented by a fiction writer centuries earlier and then simply stapled onto an already legendary figure. So can we say that Dracula was real? And be careful about people making up stories and calling it history. In Carl Sagan's original series, he talked about Hypatia of Alexandria, who was the chief librarian at the time when the Library of Alexandria contained all of the knowledge of the ancient world throughout time. She was brutally murdered by a Christian mob early in the 5th century, and the library was subsequently destroyed in an act of tragic religious ignorance where most of the works of antiquity were lost forever. And I wanted to know more about this admirable character, Hypatia. But the first time I looked her up, are you saying I have 10 minutes left? I have 10 minutes left? I started. Yeah, whoa, this is going to be bad. I'm not going to talk fast, so I don't know what you're going to do. Somebody dragged me off stage. But anyway, I tried to look her up, and the first time that I did, every reference that I found always went back to the same one and only source. And that source was so biased and therefore so questionable that I had to doubt whether she ever existed at all. Eventually, I did find another source, and it was written from the opposite perspective, because that's what you would expect of anybody famous who had actually lived. You would hear from both their proponents and their critics. Of course, not so with Jesus. And many years ago, when I was just getting started in this topic, someone told me that we have more proof of Jesus than we do of Socrates, because everything we know about Socrates came from only one source. And, of course, there were other people that wrote about Socrates, but even if there was only one source, that should be sufficient if we're only talking about something, someone's teacher, or something equally mundane as that. Because saying that you knew this guy once who taught philosophy is much more believable than telling me you know this God once who walked on water and raised the dead. And we don't even have to be talking about Jesus. If you told me that you know somebody right now who casts out demons, I'm going to have a problem with that. And it's not that I doubt that your friend exists. It's that I know demons don't exist. So even if I were to meet him, I would never be able to verify any demons that he had ever exorcised, but if he tried to do that, I might be able to expose him as a fraud. And that's one of the things that sounds believable about the Jesus story. He wasn't an actual miracle man. He was an exorcist. He was another evangelical, disreputable charlatan selling his own brand of snake oil. Christians say that everything changed when Jesus showed up, but Jesus was Jewish, and he said he's come to fulfill the laws of Moses. So he hasn't changed anything. Instead, he demands that all of his fellow Jews must follow every jot and tittle of all those old Mosaic laws, and if you don't, then you're called least in heaven. So all that Old Testament stuff still applies to Christians. Yet Jesus contradicts himself by saying we can work on the Sabbath if we have to, and we're not obliged to stone that adulteress, which is another interpolation, which is another problem with the whole thing. People added this and so many other bits to this story after the fact that it calls into question what the actual fact was, if there was one at all. So remember that the old Jewish laws were that people were supposed to wash their hands, and modern apologists say that people wouldn't have known that were it not for the wisdom of God. But even children playing in the stream know that running water will wash the mud and shit off your fingers. I mean, raccoons figured this out. And then Jesus comes along and says not to wash your hands, because he says it's not what goes into your mouth that causes you to be ill, it's what comes out of your mouth, because he's talking about incantations or uttering the Lord's name without the reverence required for making that sound, because you have to silence the critics with the fear of God even at the hushed mention of his name. Jehovah's self-described son believed in magic words and evil spirits, and was a disreputable tent revival faith healer, just like we still see on Christian TV today. And you've heard the phrase, familiarity breeds contempt. Well, Jesus had the same problem, because he said that no prophet has the respect in his own hometown, meaning that the people who knew him, grew up with him, knew he was full of shit. And another reason that he had to keep moving was because as with today's faith healers, sick folks find out right after the show that they're still sick. And the people that came onto the stage with the wheelchairs, right, and then stood up, right, well, they were given wheelchairs when they got there, and they were given payment before they walked home again. That's the same thing with the people, one leg slightly shorter than the other, and the occasional dead guy who's paid to come to life again on cue, right? This is why shows like that can't stay around town too long. But remember, Jesus' routine was all about make-believe. You just got to believe, and if you can believe hard enough via the self-hypnotic auto-deceptive illusion of faith, then you will be convinced that if you tell that mountain to jump into the sea, that it will obey. Now, because this has never happened, we know that doesn't work, but it's not from a lack of faith. Those people believe with all their might, but they don't want to test it because they want to believe it, and testing it defeats that purpose. That's why Jesus said we are not to put God to the test. That's also why Jesus told his disciples that they could perform all the miracles that he did, and they could perform more and even greater miracles than he did, not from any power from God, and not from any real power at all, but simply from psyching themselves up with the power of pretend. Pure imagination, plus a bit of showmanship to dupe the rubes, because that's how Jesus made his money. A lot of people think of Jesus as a good-hearted, gentle hippie, teaching love and forgiveness for the meek and the downtrodden. What a nice guy. But he wasn't preaching any prosperity gospel. This was the guy who advocated renunciation of worldly possessions and the redistribution of wealth, warning us that a rich man will never get into heaven, and so you better give all of your money to him so that he can use it to feed the poor. And if this sounds like what Reverend Bobby Tilton did with that bogus orphanage that in Haiti that never really existed, it's because this is the oldest scam in the book and all the religious con artists still use it. But Jesus isn't like that, right? He's the spokesman for every organization touting family values. But according to the sacred fables, Jesus came to divide families. He was a cult leader who demanded that all his disciples had to dedicate themselves to him completely, forsaking everything else to believe in and serve him. He said that if you do not hate your mother and your father and your sister and your brother and your wife and even your own life, you cannot be his disciple. This routine of demanding absolute devotion, donation, and dedication still goes on today. And remember that Jesus talks about what is written and is now fulfilled. And presumably he's talking about the Tanakh or Old Testament, but he doesn't say where it is written, and nobody's been able to find it. If Jesus had any connection to an actual God, as Christians surmise, and God wrote or manipulated men into writing the Bible, then if Jesus said that this or that prophecy should be there, it should be there. But it's not. These books are missing, along with several other books that God supposedly inspired or breathed. So, and obviously God had no control over which of the scriptures would be canonized as incontrovertibly divine and which would be discarded, dismissed, and forgotten as merely the words of men. And funny that we can't tell the difference. They look exactly the same. More importantly, remember that in all of the testaments of Jesus' wisdom, there are also comments showing that whatever he knew about theology, or indeed anything else, was limited only to what had already been written by men. So if there was an actual historic Jesus, and you could use a time machine to go find him, he wouldn't be the guy you were looking for, even if the Bible described him correctly. Instead, you'd find a heretic who endorsed slavery and referred to non-Jewish people as dogs, someone who didn't know when figs are in season or which were the smallest seeds or what that contemporary farmers were already aware of. Most importantly, he didn't know anything at all about the diseases he pretended to heal. He didn't know the world was round either, because he allegedly hoped that his second coming wouldn't happen in the winter. So he didn't know that when it's winter in this hemisphere that it's summer in the other hemisphere, because he didn't know there was another hemisphere. And it's not like I really think that he said that. I think that this was added later, along with the story of the devil taking him up to the high mountain where he could show him all the kingdoms of the earth, which is another thing that could only happen if the world was flat. So Jesus fasted for 40 days, and then he became hungry. You know, I've starved my body for twice as long as a human body can endure, but now I think I might be ready for a sandwich. We know this didn't happen. A few Christians told me that, and there's no reason that it should happen, you know, because a few Christians told me that if I didn't believe in God, then I should go out in the desert and I should starve myself for a couple of weeks, all of the while praying for God until he answers me. And I'm sure that works every time, because once you start talking to imaginary friends, any imaginary friend, including your dead relatives or whatever, it isn't long before they start talking back. But why did Jesus do this? Because if he was really the Son of God, he wouldn't have to, right? He would only do this if he was trying to convince himself of something that wasn't really true. And what did the devil say to him there? If you're really the Son of God, prove it by this test or by that test. A conversation that doesn't really make sense if it's really Satan and the Son of God. However, if there was a historical Jesus, then I'm sure this conversation happened many, many times, but it was never the devil. It was every thinking person in the audience of every congregation he went to in his travels. So that story was made up and added to the pile of legends, along with the tale of the loaves and fishes, which is repeated on 2 different occasions, yet all of his followers are equally surprised both times. Right? So we know at least one of those stories was made up. It's a lie. Why not both? So when Jesus was baptized, God spoke from a cloud to tell all the Jews, "This is my son, in whom I am very proud." And that didn't happen either. That was an appropriation of the legend of John the Baptist, who was the same character as Jesus, a prequel of Jesus, but this story was made up in order to shift the cultural importance from John the Baptist to Jesus. And the other story about Jesus walking on water to turn the fishermen into fishers of men, I don't think that's the same Jesus. There's a disconnect there, such that there's like a seam where there's two different stories being sutured together. In Jesus Christ Superstar, Pilate said that Jews produced messiahs by the sackful because they did. Then there's baby Jesus, somehow born in Bethlehem, yet he's from Nazareth, because he had to come from both places, because the authors had to adhere to all of the prophecies, even when they contradict each other. So at least one of these has to be a lie. Well, why not both? Then he's born at two different times, right? He's born before Herod's death in 4 BC and after the census of Quirinus 10 years later, right? That's not possible either. One of these has to be wrong. Why not both? Assuming there really was a Jesus, how could all of these tales of miracles come about so fast? And the biggest problem with that is that many of these miracles were already ascribed to other gods centuries earlier. Even if Jesus was crucified to atone for the sins of man, Prometheus had already done that, and Ishtar had already been crucified and resurrected. Even if baby Jesus had to be hidden from the evil king killing all the toddlers who were prophesied to usurp him, Moses had already done that, and in a story that was appropriated from another original, it was originally told about Sargon. Lord Krishna had already given sight to the blind. Several half-human god-men had already been born of virgins or otherwise immaculately conceived, and virtually every legend told of Jesus had already been done by some other deity or holy hero from centuries earlier. Listen to what Justin Martyr said about Jesus just 100 years after he's supposed to have died. When we say that the Word, who is the firstborn of God, was produced without sexual union, and that he, Jesus Christ, our teacher, was crucified and died and rose again and descended into heaven, we propound nothing different from what you believe regarding those whom you esteem sons of Jupiter. Be well assured that I am established in the knowledge of and faith in the Scriptures by those counterfeits which he who is called the devil is said to have performed among the Greeks, just as some were wrought by the Magi in Egypt, and others by the false prophets in Elijah's days. For when they tell me that Bacchus, son of Jupiter, was begotten by intercourse with Semele, and that he was the discoverer of the vine, and when they relate that being torn in pieces and having died, he rose again and ascended to heaven, and when they introduce wine into his mysteries, do I not perceive that the devil has imitated the prophecy announced by the patriarch Jacob and recorded by Moses? And when they tell that Hercules was strong and traveled all over the world and was begotten by Jove of Alcmene and ascended to heaven when he died, do I not perceive that the Scripture, which speaks of Christ strong as a giant to run his race, has been in like manner imitated? And when the devil brings forward Aesculapius as the raiser of the dead and healer of all diseases, may I not say that in this manner likewise has he imitated the prophecies about Christ? And when I hear that Perseus was begotten of a virgin, I understand that the deceiving serpent has counterfeited also this. So, did this early church father think that the devil was a time traveler, going back in time to make it look like Jesus was based on all these other gods? I don't think so, because nobody had conceived of time travel by that point, and also because he interprets Psalm 19:5 such that Jesus is literally the Son, and the Son is Jesus, strong like a giant to run his race. So Martyr evidently thinks that the stories of Jesus are older than those of the other gods. That he could have believed this in the 2nd century is already an indictment of Jesus' historicity, because Martyr obviously didn't think that Jesus was a recently living person that his grandfather might have met. When I was a young man, and I won't be much longer, but when I was a young man, I knew a priest, a high priest of a witch's coven, and his patron deity was Dionysus. And he told me the story about how Dionysus turned water into wine. And not the simple magician's trick where you pour water into a jug and you pour wine out. Anybody can do that, right? Dionysus made the fountains of the earth spring forth wine. And that's a much better trick, one that the magicians can't do, right? And then later, I read this in the stories of Greek mythology, which we know are centuries older than Jesus. And I remember thinking, why would God create his son to be a cheap sequel of an already popular human idea. Dionysus did it first, and Dionysus did it better. So one of these are fake. It's Jesus. It's the sequel. So we know at least one of those stories is made up. Why not both? John Oliver did a story about fake news, and he brought up a specific example about 19 teenagers who were cut in half by ISIS with a chainsaw. And even though there was no, you would think that if that really happened, there would be video footage, and even nobody would show that video footage. It would still run through all the channels, because of what of an outrageous story it is, and everybody would know about it. But this came from a single source and could not be verified by anyone anywhere, which makes us believe that it never really happened. Because this isn't consistent with something so outrageous if it had happened. Yet, the Gospel of Mark said that on the day Jesus was crucified, darkness fell all over the land from noon until 3 p.m. Do you mean the skies were overcast? The Gospel of Luke, which was written decades later, says the sun was obscured all over the earth, not just the land. And then Matthew says it was even worse than that, because his version added an earthquake, which the other Gospels failed to mention. And that's not all, because Matthew also added that his earthquake raised the dead. Not just that it uprooted graves, but it somehow reanimated corpses, which then went wandering downtown and were seen by many witnesses. So that story was confirmed, right? Except that none of these witnesses ever reported any of it. Not the hours of darkness, nor the earthquake, nor even a zombie apocalypse. You would think, maybe, that would be of note. So this event was confirmed by nobody, nowhere. Creation.com says that this period of darkness was no metaphor, that it was a real historical event based on eyewitness accounts and independently corroborated by a number of highly qualified ancient historians, by which they mean that the Gospels erroneously attributed to Matthew and Mark were actually written by Matthew and Mark. They also say that Luke was not only an independent historian, but the greatest historian of all time, which you'd have to be in order to write an eyewitness account 70 years later. And this is also funny that Pliny the Younger existed at the same time as Luke and was a much better historian than the greatest historian of all time. He wrote a detail-accurate depiction of the eruption of Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii in 79 CE. And if you read his account, you'll see the way the Gospels would have been written if they were either eyewitness accounts or historical events. And Creation.com also says that the other independent historians were Phlegon, Thallus, and Africanus, even though Africanus was only misinterpreting something Thallus never actually said. And Phlegon simply assumed the truth of the Gospels and rationalized that it must be talking about a 3-hour eclipse, which is impossible, but more importantly, he said this without any astronomical or historical indication. He's just trying to rationalize how the story he believes to be true could still be true, even though he can't verify it, because it ain't true. So what we have are later historians who are simply repeating or interpreting what the Gospels say and not independently corroborating any of it, which they couldn't have done anyway because they weren't contemporary with Jesus and couldn't have witnessed anything that he did, except for Josephus, who, according to Dr. Robert Price, even though Josephus lived generations too late, that he was somehow closer to Jesus than Christians would like. The line typically cited from Josephus praising Jesus as the Messiah is now commonly considered to be a Christian interpolation or addition or insertion, and not something he would have actually said. Price and others say that there is reason to believe that the Markan Passion narrative is based on Josephus' account of the interrogation and flogging of a Jerusalem prophet, Jesus ben Ananias. And this means that the most important portion of the very first gospel narrative is based not on the Testimonium Flavianum, but from a passage about a different Jesus. So the Gospels may be getting the stories of multiple Jesuses confused, even though they lived decades apart. And what I suspect, the way that the Gospels were contrived, is the way that Mel Gibson put together the life of William Wallace, with a handful of some fictitious or some real characters who lived in different centuries and never knew each other. In fact, Jesus, or Josephus, wrote of several different Jesuses, or Jesii. And he describes the death of a certain James, saintly brother of a certain Jesus, considered the anointed, and I've read Christian apologists insisting that's their Jesus, except that in this case, the Jesus and James were the sons of Damnius, and King Agrippa made Jesus of Damnius the new high priest. And just as the Gospels say that Judas died 2 different ways, on land that was both purchased by him and by the Pharisees instead of him, using the same 30 pieces of silver that he both kept and returned, such that we have 2 completely different tales, Robert Price notes how Josephus and Luke also give conflicting details of Judas of Galilee, too, which is a different person, or supposed to be, but you see how these things get confused. So Price led me to wonder whether Jesus ben Ananias, and maybe Jesus of Damnius, and who knows who else, might have been blended with another unnamed Jesus that Josephus talked about in the following quote. I saw many captives crucified and remembered 3 of them as my former acquaintances. I was very sorry at this in my mind, and I went with tears in my eyes to Titus and told him of them. So he immediately commanded them to be taken down and have the greatest care taken of them in order to their recovery. Yet 2 of them died under the physician's hands while the 3rd recovered. That is from Flavius Josephus, whose Hebrew name is Josephus bar Matthias. Now remember that in Luke 23, which was written at about the same time as Josephus' account, it says that when Jesus died, all of his acquaintances and the women who accompanied them from Galilee were standing at a distance seeing these things. And a man named Joseph from Galilee, I'm sorry, I lost my place, who was a member of the council, a good and righteous man who had not consented to their plan and action, a man from Arimathea, a city of the Jews, who was waiting for the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus, and he took it down and wrapped it in a linen cloth and laid him in a tomb in the rock where no one had yet lain. Bob Price suggests that these might be different perspectives of the same event, either looking through the eyes of Josephus bar Matthias or into the eyes of Joseph of Arimathea. Price opines that these may be the same Joseph, but different Jesuses. Maybe the guy who died on the cross was another Jesus, just like the original narrative that this story is based on. We don't know which Jesus because this is a separate document where Josephus didn't think it necessary to give the names of any of the 3 criminals being crucified together. And this will all sound preposterous to many of you. But maybe not when you consider that all of the accounts from Josephus and from Luke were written at the same time as each other and a lifetime after the famous Jesus was supposed to have died, and that they copied a bit, or Luke copied a bit from Josephus, supposedly, according to the experts I've been talking to. And remember that the story of Mark was also based on this. So if Josephus bar Matthias is Joseph of Arimathea, as Price perhaps playfully opines, and even if he's not, because Joseph of Arimathea may well be fictional too, if we assume any historic truth to the Gospels at all, then Jesus is still apparently based on a number of different actual people as an adult and 3 more legendary figures as a child, on top of all the plainly mythological characters and legends of other heroes erroneously integrated into this exaggerated compilation. Such that if you found all of those old historical Jesuses and put them in a TARDIS and brought them back to the future, none of them would recognize themselves in any of the movies based on their combined characters today, but it gets even worse than that. When I was a little boy, about 6 years old in 1969, I lived mostly in Los Angeles, and my mother used to take me to Griffith Park and to Hot Springs in the same area, and we ran into the same band of hippies in both places. And we saw them again a year or so later when we were driving downtown, and I remember they were shouting at us as we turned the corner. This was quite a shocking thing for me, because now there were these 3 girls that we'd seen before, except that now that they had shaved heads with bloody X's carved between their eyebrows, because now they were famous as the Manson family. And because of these close encounters, I felt inclined to follow this fascinating story where Charlie believed that he was Jesus, Manson meaning the Son of Man, and he believed that the Beatles were the 4 angels of the apocalypse, not of the apocalypse, the 4 angels with hair like women that are like in Revelations number 9, and that the Beatles were sending secret messages to him through the lyrics of the White Album, telling him to start a race war after which he would rule the world. So, eventually I read Helter Skelter by prosecuting attorney Vincent Bugliosi, and he explained how difficult it was to find credible witnesses to testify against Charles Manson, because everybody who knew him thought that he had psychic powers, including the ability to remotely hear telepathically anything that was being said about him. And so he would be able to do something about it even if he's locked up. And some of these witnesses even said that he used telekinesis to make their bus take flight at one point on one of their road trips. Now, in the 1960s, if you confess to believing things like that, you are not considered sane enough to get to the witness stand. Whereas nowadays, of course, that's what you need to say in order to get elected. Thank you. The point is, and I know I'm over time, and I thank you everybody for being so patient, and I'm almost done. The point is that these things were believed by people with at least a primary public school education in the enlightenment of the space age. And these beliefs were repeated about a man who is still alive today. So if this had all happened 2,000 years ago, with every exaggeration or alternation that accepted as gospel by people who are determined to believe whatever they're told without reservation, then I could see an alternate timeline where my now Mormon family might instead be attending the church of Charles Manson of Latter-day Saints. Thank you.